So I think, I was being deceitful to God and also to myself.
Sinner. No, I'm playing.
Yeah. Welcome back to the Jack's podcast. I'm Jack.
I am also Jack.
And today we're filming the podcast like 2 days after we filmed the last one. We are going away for spring break, which is next week. And so, actually, technically, it's
tomorrow.
This week.
Tomorrow.
As of this episode being
released,
we're on spring break right now. Hope you guys
know about that grind, boy.
Hope you guys are having a great spring break. I, in the future, will be in San Jose, and you, in the future, will be in Connecticut.
Yes, sir.
This is kind of weird, but...
Might also pop out to Vermont to go snowboarding with my brother.
That's fire.
He's in Portugal right now, which is crazy. He just randomly sent me a flick of him on an airplane, and the Snapchat location said Iceland, and he just didn't tell me he was going to Iceland. I was like, what are you doing in Iceland, bro? And he's like, I'm just hanging out with the fellas. I'm like, all right.
Did he tell your mom?
She paid for the flight, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Which is, Mike, you're 21 or 22. You got to start paying. I think he's 22, so you got to start paying for that Johnson. But yeah.
Well, today we're going to be talking about suffering, which is a pretty hot topic because it's something that a lot of Christians don't like to talk about. A lot of people like to preach the prosperity gospel of like, follow Jesus and everything's going to be happy sunshine. You're going to get $500 billion and everything's going to go great. But one of the only things promised other than death through the Christian life is suffering.
Yeah.
You are promised that you are going to suffer as a Christian.
Which is ironic that people don't want to talk about the thing that is going to happen.
Yeah. And so I think it's important to talk about. It's a very important topic to talk about because in the midst of suffering, it's really easy to give up on God and give up on Jesus and walk away from faith when you experience hard times. And suffering is ultimately one of the most important things that you have to go through as a Christian because there is growth and just maturity that you experience that you can't get from anything other than suffering. So yeah, we just want to talk a little bit about that, kind of our own experience of suffering, but also what the word says. And so Jack over here has his Bible open and he has a verse that he wants to read to all of you. So
yeah,
take it away.
This is from James. It says, brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think James meant when he say, like the Lord finally brought about? I think there's like two different answers here, so try to touch on those.
I think one of them is at the end of the suffering, there is a reward.
Yeah.
I know elsewhere in James it says, like, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. And it's like, as hard as it is to go through, there is something at the end. There is an end to the suffering, and there's a reward at the end. Kind of blanking on what the other thing is. What?
Well, you were kind of talking about it earlier, but it's like, it's not necessarily like you actually like go through the suffering and like at the end get the blessing, but it's like what you do in the midst of suffering. And I think a couple of semesters ago, I was having a pretty hard time and was feeling just pretty hopeless, and I kind of was just like waiting for God to pull me out of like my current situation. But you brought about like an entire different perspective that I never considered. And it was like, okay, well, what do you think God wants you to learn in the midst of suffering? So what are the things that you think you can learn in the midst of trials?
I think one of the things is to trust God because I know a form of suffering is losing something that you place trust in. If you place trust in money and then you go broke, that is a way that the Lord can try and push you to trust him with your finances rather than your own capabilities and understandings. I think also maturity and spiritual wisdom is something that you can learn because suffering, it's like a spectrum. There's so much that can be learned from suffering. Suffering can be small or it can be really huge, and I think each type of suffering that you go through, there's something to learn in terms of how to persevere and endure for the future. And so I think, that's just one of the things that you can get out of it.
Yeah, I think one of the main things that I learned in the midst of like any hardship in my life is just trusting that God is like who he says he is, and he says like my word will not come back void. And a lot of the times like people can take this idea that their timing is correlated with God's timing, and that like God is essentially lying to them when he says like my word won't come back void, and they're like, oh, but this hasn't happened yet. But it's like God is working on a completely different timeline when it comes to like saving you from certain trials and stuff like that. And I think the verse that is really touching to me, which we actually talked about last night in Bible study, is like, blessed are those who have not yet seen but still have believed. And it's like you can wait on God in like two different ways. You can wait for him to just like help you with what you're doing and take away nothing from it, or you can like say, okay, I know that I'm in the midst of this, but I'm going to put to use what is happening right now. I'm not just going to like let it go to waste. And I think going into my second semester, my freshman year, I really had that mindset of just like looking at the clock and like waiting for suffering to be over. And then I had like this conversation with Jack about how you can learn stuff from this. And I kind of like thought like I knew it all at that point and was just like, okay, there's not like much to learn. I feel like I'm pretty well knowledged like in the word, but I don't think I really faced like a ton of suffering and trials. And in that like 6-month duration, I guess, was when I really learned how to like communicate and sit with God. And it's really easy, and I'm sure like everybody can really relate to this. It's like it's super easy to raise your hand in church and praise God like when you're doing well and everything is going fine. But I think it's really difficult to do that in the midst of suffering. And it doesn't say to like rejoice in the Lord only when things in your life are going good, but it says to rejoice in him like continuously, especially in the hard moments, because you have confidence and security, knowing that the Lord will come through for you. But what do you think is something that you have learned in the midst of suffering, and like how did that come about? Like you personally, like a personal experience you went through.
I think trusting God's plans over my own was a really hard thing to learn, but it's something that I learned through suffering. I had a friend in high school who was one of my best friends, and we had a pretty bad falling out, and I kind of thought to myself, in the sense of God's plan and my plan, like, why did this have to happen? What is the point of it? This relationship was very healthy, and it was not really foreseen that this falling out was gonna happen. And I thought, both of us were benefiting from this friendship.
Yeah.
We were, loving each other well, being there for each other, being brothers, but it had to be taken away. And I kind of questioned God, and it took about 8 months, or no, let's say it's like 7 months to reach the point where I realized I prefer my plans over God's plans. And I remember saying to God, whatever you want me to learn and grow, I would trade all of that to have this friendship back. Like, I would rather keep this friendship that I had than grow and mature in the ways that you want me to. And another thing that I questioned was, why do I have to learn this way? Why can't I learn through someone else? Why can't I learn through something else?
Yeah.
And ultimately, I still don't really know the why. Yeah. It's like, I think there'll be a moment later down the line where I'm sitting and I'll recognize that I just did something or thought of something, and I wouldn't have been able to think that or do that without going through this falling out with a friend. But I think, questioning God's ways and his will was something that I really struggled with. And ultimately where I'm at now is I came to the realization that God's ways are kind of ununderstandable.
Yeah, his ways are not our ways.
Yeah, his ways are so much more grand and so much bigger and so complex that our human brains cannot understand it or comprehend it.
Yeah.
And so we have to trust that, God is doing things for our benefit, and we can have proof that he does do that for others, like for Job and for other people in the Bible who suffered and then became better out of it. We have proof that God does grow you and allow suffering for a reason. And based on that, we have to trust that what we're going through is we're going to get something out of it. We're going to learn something. We're going to mature. We're going to grow. And yeah, I think right now, I'm still believing for restoration in the friendship. And, I don't necessarily foresee it in the near future. And it's not like I'm counting down the days, or I'm counting the days of how long it's been since, the falling out happened. But I still trust that, at the right time, God will bring us back together. And even if it doesn't happen, I'm still going to trust God that this happened for my betterment, and I'm going to be a better person out of it. And the growth I experienced, it will get to the point where I would not trade it for anything. And I think that's where I'm at now, is like, I no longer say, I'd rather have this friendship than learn what I'm learning now and growing in this way. But I'm able to say, it sucks, it hurts, it's painful. But ultimately, I'm trusting God that it's for my betterment.
Yeah, I thought one thing that you mentioned, I forgot what it was, but it's basically the idea where it says, like, the Lord, like, oh, his ways are not our ways. Like, it says the Lord goes ahead of you. So, like, he sees into the future. Like, there could have been things, like, in any circumstance that we think, like, oh, this would have been so great if this happened. But if this does happen, like, then, like, ahead in the future, like, something could go wrong because of that, like, thing that we want so bad. And I remember, like, talking about this, like, and it's like a, like, kind of silly analogy, but it's like, if a kid wants a knife, like if a child wants a knife to cut his food, like, he thinks, like, that's a good thing to get the knife and cut the food. But in reality, like, God knows, like, that wouldn't be a smart idea, because he would probably end up, like, cutting himself and hurting himself. And it says somewhere in the New Testament, like, the Lord is patient, or not slow in keeping his promise, but it's so we are protected. And I think the idea of, like, God, like, looking ahead at the things that we can't see, like you said, our human minds just can't comprehend, is so cool, that, like, he looks out for us in that way. But before that 7-month period where you were, like, experiencing this, what was your relationship with God like prior to that?
I think I was super angry at, the person or the friend that I had the falling out with, but I was also pretty upset with God, because it felt like it came out of nowhere, and I couldn't see why it was happening, and it was like, what's the point of this? It would be a lot more convenient, and it would be a lot easier to go about life if, like, this falling out never happened, and if, we were still friends. And there was a lot of anger towards God in what felt like him, tearing apart a friendship where,
It was good.
Yeah, it's like God's plans are for the betterment of his people. And, Romans 8:28, which says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And I thought that, I'm God's child. He's God's child. Why would God pull us apart?
Yeah.
And, I wrestled a lot with God in the anger that, his plans are, we have to be, separated.
Yeah.
For his plans. And so it was really hard to accept that.
Do you think that you, like, in the midst of, like, wrestling with God and being angry at God, do you think that you brought those feelings to him, like, wholeheartedly, or kind of, like, hid it?
I think I hid it for a while. 'Cause also at that point in my relationship with God, I wasn't being fully candid and honest in prayer. I was holding back because I thought, I shouldn't approach God in a certain way. I shouldn't approach God angry. I should, approach him humbly and also like of sound mind. But I've come to learn, God can handle all of my thoughts and all of the things that I'm feeling, and I should come to God as emotional as I am in the moment. I shouldn't hold back, and I shouldn't try and, go somewhere else to calm down before coming to God, because ultimately you're supposed to be going to God to calm down.
Yeah, I think in a way it's honoring to God to go to him like as you're feeling, because if you're going like with like it says like he knows the depth of our hearts, and it's like if you're going to him and not bringing everything you have on the table to him, like in a way you're being deceitful towards God in prayer.
So I think I was being deceitful to God and also to myself.
Sinner. No, I'm playing.
Yeah.
I think the first time I ever experienced like real, or like when I started to, maybe like a month before I gave my life to God, I think ultimately it came to the point where the world couldn't fix what I was going through, and I just had like nowhere to turn but God. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll just like give it a try. But I remember like I was not well versed in the word. I didn't like know anything other than like John 3:16 and I remember that when I was going through this suffering and stuff, my mom was like telling me like, like God has like a plan for you and stuff, and I'm like, that's so stupid. Like, one, he could like allow me to learn these things that he wants me to learn, like through like you said, like other things like blessings and stuff like that. And I think that God can do that, but it talks about like trials prove the genuineness of your faith. And it's like, who are you going to turn to when things get hard? Are you going to like say, are you going to rebuke God and tell him like, you shouldn't have done this, like this is not what I want in my life? Are you going to trust in his plan for you? And I think that's something that I really struggled with, was like, I really had a hard time believing that the anxiety that I was having was going to lead to somebody else's like goodness, or even like to God's glory. And the idea of him going ahead of us, and it's like looking back on that now, like I didn't know that this experience of me having anxiety would, one, end up giving my life to Christ, but like two, like being able to go to Chapman or talking to my brother or talking to like a random person on the street or leading Bible study. I'm not saying like I'm the one that's doing all the work, but like God used that to form me into like the person that I am today. And I wouldn't have learned what it's like to suffer and like what it's like in just complete darkness if I hadn't endured those things. And it's like God has used me to bless other people with like Bible study or just like being a kind person to them. And I think it's just a great testimony that you have to trust God in what he's doing. And sometimes I think people just like overcomplicate things, and I definitely overcomplicate things. But I remember I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were like, God knows what he's doing. Like, you don't have to stress about it. And I think that is so simple, and it's really cool to think like, all right, yeah, he does know what he's doing. But yeah.
Yeah, I really like what you said about how suffering can help others. I think, the things you go through, it can be a lonely experience because you can feel like you're alone and you're the only person in the whole world who's going through whatever you're going through.
Yeah.
I know for me, when I was going through the falling out, I had pretty much no one who had ever gone through that and no one who knew what I was feeling. And so, my closest friends, I could talk to them and I could try and process it with them and like pray with them and stuff. But ultimately, it felt like I was alone because no one had ever experienced this in my life. And I had no one to really talk to who could understand exactly what I was going through. But something I realized is now I know what this is like. And I know what it feels like to be alone in that moment and to feel like nobody understands what I'm going through. But someone else who's going through this, who feels like they don't know what it's like and they feel alone, I can be there for them in that moment and comfort them and really empathize with them. And I think that's super important, to be able to walk through a situation with someone and know what they're going through because you've experienced it yourself. I don't have a ton of experiences of doing it yet, but I know like falling outs and, you know, conflicts
is a common thing.
Yeah, it's a really common thing. And to me, it felt uncommon, but I recognize that it's a lot more common than I thought it was. And so I just think, you know, being in ministry and, you know, especially at church, there's going to be a lot of people who go through that. And I'm also in youth ministry. And so I feel like high schoolers will have a lot of these problems. And I feel like in a situation where someone comes to me and talks to me about that, I'll be able to really understand what they're going through and just comfort them in a way that, you know, someone who hasn't gone through it won't be able to.
Knowing what you know now, what do you think you would do if you're in a situation where like the people around you at InterVarsity or your friends back home or whoever haven't experienced that? What do you think you would do in the midst of trials?
Like if they're going through a trial or if I'm going through a trial?
If you're going through something, or like what you would recommend for people that are going through something and they don't have like-minded people around them, what do you think you would advise them to do?
I would honestly say seek comfort from God and from Jesus, because at least for like what felt like a betrayal and what felt like a falling out and a loss of friendship, you know, Jesus experienced that.
Yeah.
Jesus was betrayed by Judas.
Yeah.
And Judas was one of the 12 disciples, which meant he was closer to Jesus than
anybody else.
Like, yeah, pretty much everyone except for like Peter, James, and John. But Jesus knew Judas was going to betray him,
and still
let him sit at the table at the Last Supper. And it's like Jesus was betrayed in such an awful and horrible way, and really he's the only person who understands what I'm going through.
Yeah, I think there is something so cool about like I can't think of one off the top of my head of like problems in the world or situations that God, or Jesus rather, like didn't experience on his time on earth. And the reason why I was like asking that question is like it kind of has been like prominent in my life recently that like dealing with like a loss of a person, like especially like my dad, I was like really like angry and upset with God, and I was like, I don't even have like anybody out here to talk to about that. And like I know that like most of the people around me like still have their parents around, but I remember one day just sitting in my bed and I was like, I feel like I have nobody really here to talk to about this. So I just like felt led to look up like what does it say about losing a parent, and this video came across, and it's like unironically it says that like Jesus most likely, like Joseph his father, like his father, you know, he most likely died when he was on earth. And I was so like mad at God before that, because I was like, you don't, and I was like condemning him. I was like, you don't even understand what I'm going through, because this isn't something that happened to you, because Mary was a virgin. And I realized that like Joseph was like a father figure in Jesus's life, and I said like he didn't technically have a dad here on earth, and I was so upset with him. And then like one day that thought came to me to look it up, and I just got like so like humbled, and I started like apologizing to God, because I was like just tearing him apart for like the fact that like I'm like, you don't relate to this. Sure, like you know what it's like to live through, but you haven't like lived through it, because he's obviously like omniscient, but he hasn't actually lived through this kind of suffering. And I think the main point is that like God knows what you're going through, and that's like a comfort in of itself, but he definitely like most likely has experienced what you're going through in the midst of suffering. And I think like it's really easy sometimes to just put the blame on God and like be ignorant, I guess, of like what your circumstance is and how it correlates to God. But he was betrayed, he was lied to, he experienced grief not only through his father but through his friend Lazarus. He pretty much experienced it all. And my advice for people that are like going through something that maybe you don't have people that are going through the same circumstances you around, like in your circle, like the only person that can comfort you at that point, I think, is God. And I think it's really important to seek him first, and or seek first his kingdom, and like everything else will be added onto you. Like maybe he'll send somebody into your life that has experienced something similar or learned a same concept or theme. And I think it's just like really encouraging to know that like the man who lived a perfect life probably suffered more than we ever will.
Yeah. I guess I want to ask, in the midst of your current suffering, how are you enduring it, and what is your processing like?
Yeah, I think it's obviously a huge comfort knowing that my dad was saved. And I remember even talking to my brother about it. He's like, I don't know what it would be like if I lost a family member or a close friend and they like weren't saved. Like, it's impossible to, your mind as a Christian can go to two places: they're in heaven or hell. Like, they either knew God or they didn't. And I think like as a person of the world that doesn't necessarily believe in God, like they have 1,000 different routes they can take to, oh, maybe they're going to be reincarnated. Maybe they're like with me and their spirit is with me, or maybe they're in heaven or hell. Like, they don't know. And I think God removed the burden of confusion from my life. I think something that's really, really cool is my brother, who's not necessarily like into faith or pursuing a relationship with God as much as like he wants to, and I admire him for attempting to like grow in his faith. But I think a month or a week or so after my dad passed, he said like, God, like I want you to speak to me in a dream and show me that like my dad's okay. And I'm not going to go like too much into detail, but he had this dream where like my dad was like in the car with him and just like looked at him and said like the words like, I'm okay and everything's okay. And I think like that comfort, like you cannot get that anywhere else. And I think like the Holy Spirit and the Lord like continuously speaking to me and like just providing me comfort is such like a great relief to have and like a source to go to. And we were talking about this like in the last episode, but like allowing the Lord to be your punching bag in some sense is a good thing, because you can take it out on him and he can handle it. And David wrote some of the Psalms, right?
Yeah, he wrote most of them.
Sure. Like a majority of the Psalms.
Yeah.
And I remember I was talking to Graydon about this. Like, he's like bipolar basically. Like, he's 1 second he's like, God, I love you, you're the greatest. And the next he's like, why have you forsaken me? Stuff like that. And I think that's like, at least with the process of grief that I've been going through is like the same with that, is that sometimes I think like, God, I thank you for the fact that like my dad knew you and that like I have you here to comfort me in this. And then other days when it's like, when it doesn't feel like the Lord is as present as I want him to be, just like cursing at him and like being so upset with him and like pleading with comfort. And I think the one thing in my life that I've never been able to understand is simply God. There's never been a situation or like a question that's been asked of me and I haven't like with time been able to figure it out. And I don't think anybody will ever be able to figure out why God does certain things or why he doesn't do certain things, because his ways are simply just not our ways and we have to submit to God blindly. So I try to take it like day by day. And another thing it realizes that like this suffering is the one thing that's definite, is that it will end at some point. Like, my time will come and I'm linking up with Jesus. And like, write this down: if you see me, or if you don't see me in heaven, you have gone to hell. And that's a joke from the past. And I just don't, even my brother's like, dude, you just got to thug it out for like 75 more years and then you're good to go for all of eternity. So I think there are so many different ways that the Lord can comfort you, whether that's like in your present moment or reflecting on past moments or looking towards ahead the future and knowing that like you will receive the crown of glory. And it doesn't say like just know that something good will happen and that the Lord will come through for you. It says like fight the good fight of faith. And I really encourage everybody to do just that. It's a fight to be a Christian. It's like the world's going to hate you because you serve God. And I think just fighting the good fight of faith and knowing that you have a very limited amount of time here on earth in comparison to eternity and how long you're going to be in heaven. It's like a minuscule difference. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's really admirable that you're able to be hopeful in the midst of such a hard season and a hard situation. I guess, what would you say to people who are going through something similar to you? What is the hope that you would encourage them with, just from your own personal experience of going through this?
Yeah, I guess the main hope is knowing that whatever happens, and it doesn't have to be something as severe as that, but whatever happens in your life that's a form of suffering was intended by Satan for you to be harmed. But the Lord can take any situation and turn it into glory for him. You can think about the story of Job. You can think about like my testimony. You can think about even Jack's testimony is like he's giving advice right now on how to handle certain things, and know that like God does not put anything to waste. And it says that God is the one who allows trials. So why would he allow a trial that's going to amount to nothing and produce no fruition? It's not plausible. So I just know that God is who he says he is, and there are going to be times when you want to give up on him, and it's going to be a decision you have to make. And I think it's a really tough decision. I remember at the beginning of the semester this year, I came back and felt so alone and was like so upset. And I said to God, like, no matter what happens, like I will serve you until like the ends of the earth, until my time comes up or like you come back. And I just decided like, I know who God is. I know what he's done before in the past. And I know that right now it feels like what's happening outweighs every ounce of good that God has given me. But I know that the Lord doesn't give a half portion or a full portion back. He gives a double portion back to his people. So the amount of suffering, like Romans 8:28, it's like the suffering I'm going through right now or even back then, like won't compare to the glory that's coming. And I think the idea of submitting yourself to God and knowing that like his ways are not our ways, it's not something you'll ever be able to figure out, and just give yourself to God.
It's really good. As we wrap up, I just want to read a little passage from James, the very opening. It's James 1:2-4. It says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything."
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
That's it, man. That's, the good things that are going to come from suffering, and you can let it go to waste, or you can use your experience as a way to glorify God and grow as a person in your faith. Thank you guys for watching this episode. This was a ton of fun to film. I hope you all have a wonderful spring break, or coming back to spring break. I don't know.
Yeah. Safe travels. We'll see you in the next episode.
Peace.
Goodbye.